This tutorial is going to cover some common grammar and style issues. There are a lot of grammatical mistakes that we can make as writers, and there's no way that one video tutorial or one lesson or even a dozen lessons could cover all of them. And we each have our own grammatical issues that we struggle with. So in general, in both English 101 and 102, I handle grammatical issues on a one-on-one basis. So when I see you making mistakes in your specific essay, I address those on your essay instead of going over grammatical issues with the entire class, because some people may struggle with one issue while others do not. But what I've done for this tutorial is picked out the 4 things that I see most often in writing and the most problematic mistakes that I see. There are a lot of grammatical mistakes that technically are mistakes, but that don't interfere very much with reading. Then there are other grammatical mistakes that really interfere with someone's ability to read and understand what you're saying. So I've picked out 4 things that I see very, very often that I thought were common enough for a video tutorial that everyone can watch and benefit from. So I'm going to go over these, show you some examples of the incorrect mistake, and then how it's corrected, and explain a little bit about what the mistake is. So the first one, and by far the most common mistake that I see, is a comma splice. And on your essays, that'll be marked with CS for comma splice. A comma splice is one very specific kind of error with commas. And commas, I will admit, can be confusing because you might have been taught put in a comma every time you take a breath, which everyone breathes a little bit differently, so that is not the greatest rule to go by. But a lot of things with commas are not definite rules, where I might choose to put one in a sentence, someone else might not, and it's really not that I'm right or they're right or one of us is wrong. It's just that we're going by a slightly different standard, and so it can get really, really confusing. So comma splice, though, is a really specific kind of mistake. It's really common, and it's really easy to fix. So the first sentence here on these examples is an example of a comma splice. So it's a very simple sentence, but I think it will illustrate the mistake. A comma splice, what that is when you have 2 complete sentences. So sentences that can stand on their own are separated only with a comma. Right? So if you notice, I went to the store, that's a whole sentence. That could stand on its own. I bought eggs. Again, a whole sentence that makes sense on its own. Well, when all I put is a comma between them, that's a comma splice. So when you see CS on your paper, what you've done, wherever I mark it, or if I say that you have issues with comma splices, is that you have a pattern of having 2 sentences that really and truly could stand completely on their own, and the only thing separating them is a comma, because a comma is not strong enough to separate a sentence, if you want to think of it that way. So you have a lot of options for how to fix it. Probably the one that you're most familiar with, all right, is when you were growing up, you probably learned this way back in elementary school, that you can add the word and. Usually a conjunction is what they're called. So I went to the store, I leave in my comma and say, and I bought eggs. Then it's perfectly fine. Or I could change it slightly. I went to the store and bought eggs. Now, why you don't need a comma here, okay, is because bought eggs is not enough. You want to think of it as you have 2 sides. Before your comma or your and or whatever you're going to put, you have I went to the store, which is a complete sentence, and I bought eggs, which is a complete sentence. So you just want to look on either side. So I went to the store, all right, that's still a complete sentence. But bought eggs, that's not a sentence on its own. So that's why the and is strong enough on its own. It doesn't need a comma with it because you don't have 2 complete sentences. Okay. Now the easiest way to fix it is just a period. I just make it 2 sentences. If you want to get really fancy, you could use a semicolon. Okay. Now semicolons are not something that you use a lot in writing because they don't have very many, there's not that many scenarios where you use a semicolon. But I tried to show you here why you would use a semicolon, or could use one here but not in this sentence. The way a semicolon works is it has to go between two complete sentences. Just like the comma and the conjunction or period. But those sentences have to be related. So usually it's that the second sentence is somehow a follow-up to the first one. So I went to the store, semicolon, I bought eggs, makes sense. I bought eggs at the store. I went to the store, semicolon, I love dogs, would be incorrect. Because unless it was I went to the pet store, it wouldn't make any sense to follow I went to the store with I love dogs. So that's why it would not be appropriate to use a semicolon in this situation. Right? So all a comma splice is you've put a comma where you should have put either a period, a comma with a conjunction, or a semicolon. So it's really easy to fix, but it's a really, really common mistake, and it does interfere with reading. Because when I see a comma, I'm not expecting that the next thing is a complete sentence. So it screws up the rhythm of the reading. Okay. Very similar to that, in terms of screwing up the rhythm of the reading, is incomplete sentences. So on your papers, those will be marked with INS. Right, an incomplete sentence is not a full sentence. Now, we could get into, if I wanted to, all kinds of discussion of subjects and verbs and objects and what it takes to have a sentence and all of that. Because I don't want to overwhelm you and because I just want to simplify this, we're going to use a really unsophisticated way to tell if something's a complete sentence, and that's, does it sound complete? So how I usually illustrate this is if you walked up to someone and just said what you have, before the period, would it sound complete? So imagine if I walked up to you, or someone walked up to you and said, when I was a kid. And that was the sentence, okay? If they walked up to you and said, when I was a kid, and then just looked at you, you would feel like there was something missing, because that's not a complete sentence, okay? Or if they walked up to you and said, because I was sick, nothing before it, nothing after it, just because I was sick. Okay? Now, we use incomplete sentences in conversation. If I ask, why were you absent? And you say, because I was sick. Okay? But in writing, it's a little bit different than in speaking. So, you see incomplete sentences quite a bit, and almost all of the time you can fix them by just joining them with what you put before it or after it. So notice here, when I was a kid, I played with Barbies. It's all one sentence, and now it makes sense. Or, I was absent because I was sick. All one sentence, makes sense. Here's another one. If you walked up to someone and said, since the 1960s, and there would just be this big lull. What happened since the 1960s? So, because this is what we do. For some reason, when we're writing, we put a period when we didn't mean to, but it creates this confusion for the reader. So, since the 1960s, racial relations have improved dramatically in this country. So, usually when you see that incomplete sentence notation on your paper, it just means that you need to combine two sentences. Usually the one that came before the incomplete sentence or the one that came after it. And to check to see if you have them, just read your sentences in your essay slowly, and stop at the end of each one and think, does that sound like it could stand on its own as a complete sentence? When I was a kid, doesn't. So you know that it's an incomplete sentence. Run-on sentences are actually not that common, but the main reason I want to talk about this is because many people don't understand what they are. And for a long time, when I was growing up, I didn't have a good understanding of what run-on sentences were, and that was someone who was good at English. So a run-on sentence is not a long sentence. It's two complete sentences with no punctuation between them. Nothing joining them. Where with a comma splice, it only has a comma. With a run-on, it's just there's nothing there. There's no conjunction, there's no comma, there's no period, there's no semicolon, there's nothing. But a lot of people have believed their whole lives that a run-on sentence is just a long sentence. You can write a really long sentence that is completely grammatically correct. So it all has to do with how you link those sentences together. So I gave an example here. The University of Kentucky Wildcats have been very successful under John Calipari. They won the NCAA championship in 2012. They were runner-ups in the 2012 tournament. Now this is incorrect because this is a sentence right here, and this is a sentence right here, and then this is another sentence. So there's 3 actual complete thoughts in this sample, but there's absolutely nothing between them. And so all we have to do to fix this is make it clear that those are separate sentences. So one way to do that is I put a period here, and then I put a semicolon, or no, I didn't put a semicolon. I put a comma and a conjunction. I could have put a semicolon, okay? And there are dozens of other ways that we could have fixed this, but it's just tiny things. You know, either a comma and a conjunction, a semicolon, a period, something to let the reader know that we've moved on to a new sentence, rather than just cramming them together. Now, the last thing I want to talk about are just some commonly confused words. These are words that almost everybody has trouble sometimes keeping straight what they mean. So I just picked out the 4 that I see most often. Affect and effect, they sound very similar, okay? But affect, okay, is a verb, meaning it's an action, and effect is a noun. Okay, now if those terms are not useful, okay, you can usually replace the word effect. One way to test it is replace effect or effects, okay, with consequences or with consequence. And if it makes sense, replace the word. If it makes sense with the word consequence, it's EFF. If it doesn't, it's AFF. Okay? So the effects of the storm, the consequences of the storm, were severe and affected everyone in the county. Okay? But see, it wouldn't have made sense if I said the consequences of the storm were severe and consequence everyone in the county. So that's a really easy way to tell. If you can replace the word with consequence or consequences and it makes sense, then it's EFF. If it doesn't, it's probably AFF. Okay. Weather and whether probably has to do with just our pronunciation. Whether is an either or kind of situation. Weather is rain, snow, sun, wind, that sort of thing. So I don't know whether it will rain or not. The weather is always unpredictable. So I think this is just we get probably even typing too fast, or we've heard the words and that sort of thing and not seen them. Your and you are, okay? While you are is possession, all right? And your is you are. So this is really easy to test for. Replace it with the 2 words you are, and if it doesn't make any sense, it's the other one. So don't share your opinion. Whose opinion? Yours. It's possession until you are sure of the facts. But notice if I'd said don't share you are opinion, that wouldn't make any sense. So that's just a way to test it. Again, if it doesn't make any sense as you are, then it should be your. Okay. Now, over the last few years, I've noticed people are better with this one. It gets talked about a lot on the internet. It gets talked about a lot on Facebook and stuff. So I think people are learning this. But this one is still really commonly confused. And you do have 3 to deal with. Okay. So there is just like your. It's they are. Okay. There is possession. Possessive. So someone owning something. It belongs to them. If it's neither one of those, it's THERE. Okay. So their car. So that's possessive. Whose car? Theirs. The car belongs to them. Wasn't there. So that's a location. When we arrived. I suppose they're running late. They are. So again, you can check it by putting in they are. If it doesn't make any sense, then you know it's one of the other 2. Then once you've narrowed that down, just decide, am I talking about something that belongs to someone? Either a physical object or an idea or an opinion. And if it's not that, then you know it's THERE. So it's process of elimination if that's something that confuses you. Okay. Again, I will note these things on your drafts as I see them and as they become an issue. Everyone makes grammatical mistakes. Even the best writer has some grammatical mistakes in their writing. So it's not that you should stress out if your essay is not perfect. But if you're doing a lot of this and it's happening all the time, it can really, really interfere with someone's ability to read your writing, and most people are not going to bother trying to figure out what you mean. So in a job application situation, you've had to write a letter of application, and if it's riddled with grammatical mistakes, that committee or whoever is probably not even going to look at your resume or look at the rest of your application. So it can be an obstacle if you have a lot of these grammatical errors. So it is something that you want to start noticing what you struggle with, figuring out what your patterns are, coming up with some solutions, whether that's testing them like I've suggested or whatever, but just trying to work through those. Okay? So that's just the most common ones that I wanted to identify. If you need help with grammar at any point, there's a lot of resources in your handbook, or you can always come sit down with me and I'm happy to go over samples or go over your essay with you. And that concludes this tutorial.